In her haunting autobiography, Frances Farmer, the brilliant but tormented Hollywood actress, began with words that chill the soul. For 8 years, I was an inmate in a state asylum for the insane. In those years, I deteriorated into a wild, frightened creature intent only on survival. I was assaulted by orderlies, gnawed on by rats, and poisoned by tainted food. I was chained in padded cells, strapped into straitjackets, and half drowned in ice baths. The asylum itself was a steel trap, and I was not released alive and victorious. I crawled out, mutilated, whimpering, and terribly alone. But I survived. These harrowing words painted Frances Farmer as Hollywood's ultimate sacrificial lamb, a symbol of innocence destroyed by cruelty. Over time, her story only grew darker. Tales of unimaginable torment emerged, including the claim of a lobotomy, a brutal procedure said to have silenced her rebellious spirit forever. But as captivating as this tragedy is, how much of it is true? The books, the headlines, the biopics, they built a narrative so powerful it eclipsed the real Frances Farmer. A narrative not born of her life alone, but shaped by opportunists, ghostwriters, false investigative journalists, and even the Church of Scientology. Each played a role in creating a story where the lines between fact and fiction blurred, until the myth consumed the truth, and the writers and filmmakers found themselves in court, battling over what was real and what was not, and who had the right to tell her story. What truly happened to Frances Farmer? How did her life become a battleground for competing narratives? And why does her story continue to haunt us decades after her death? Tonight, we peel back the layers of myth and uncover the real Frances Farmer, the actress who dared to defy Hollywood, the people that tried to profit off her, and the machine that sought to destroy her. If you like stories like this, please consider subscribing. Every week we post new stories of women throughout history, and we'd love to have you join our growing community. And now, let's uncover the truth behind the Hollywood destruction of Frances Farmer. Frances Farmer grew up in the gray drizzle of Seattle, the daughter of a lawyer and a domineering, crusading mother whose love often felt like a clenched fist. Even as a teenager, Farmer refused to conform to the saccharine expectations of her time. She won an essay contest with a piece titled God Dies, a blistering meditation on faith, or the absence of it. In her essay, she questioned a deity who could answer mundane prayers while letting innocent people suffer and perish. The essay predictably became a local scandal. To Seattle's buttoned-up elite, Frances Farmer was no longer a promising young woman, but a heretic, a teenage pariah. The experience hardened her, made her long for escape, and instilled in her a restless defiance that would mark her for life. At the University of Washington, she found a brief reprieve. Immersed in the bohemian life of the 1930s, she studied Stanislavski, learned the art of getting drunk on cheap liquor, and spent late nights discussing politics and theater in smoky cafes. But even these pursuits were not enough. Frances longed for something grander, something electric, New York City, but even the grandest dreams must contend with earthly realities, and Frances had none of the means required to chase hers. She was broke, and the cost of a bus ticket across the country was far beyond her means. Then in 1933, salvation came in the unlikeliest form, a contest sponsored by a local communist newspaper. The prize? A trip to Russia. Frances was far less interested in Moscow than in Manhattan, the city from which the boat would embark. On her return from Russia, she didn't go back to Seattle. Instead, she cashed in her return ticket and set her sights on New York. She pounded the pavement, making the rounds at casting agencies, a small-town girl with big city dreams. Hollywood called before Broadway did. Frances landed a standard starlet contract with Paramount Pictures, not the stage career she craved, but the money promised to pave the way to her true ambition. She arrived in Los Angeles on her 22nd birthday, a wide-eyed young woman thrust into the Hollywood machine. Paramount wasted no time shaping her into their latest glamour girl. She was sham married to another studio contract player, the man who would later become known as Leif Erikson. They called it publicity. Frances called it humiliating, Despite her distaste, Farmer became an undeniable success. She starred in 2 box office hits in her first few years: Rhythm on the Range, a Bing Crosby musical, and Come and Get It, a melodrama initially helmed by Howard Hawks, until he was fired. Frances openly rebelled against his replacement, an act of defiance that earned her more whispers than applause. She bristled against the artificiality of her life as a Hollywood contract player. The fake smiles, the endless fawning, the hollowness of it all. By 1937, her patience for mediocrity had worn thin. After co-starring with Cary Grant in the abysmal period drama The Toast of New York, Farmer abandoned Hollywood entirely. She broke her contract and fled to New York, where she finally found her footing on the stage. Starring in Clifford Odets' The Golden Boy, Farmer came alive. For the first time, she felt creatively fulfilled, her talent met with equal passion by an audience that adored her. But there was something more, a romance with Odets himself. The press, predictably, had a field day, gleefully reporting on their affair. But for Frances, it wasn't scandal, it was love. The play's run was a success, but the fairy tale was doomed. Clifford Odets, bound by his own contradictions, was already married. When the time came for the production to travel to London, he sent Frances a 2-line telegram, brusquely ending both their affair and her dreams of continuing with the show. Her role was given to another actress. Heartbroken and furious, Farmer returned to Hollywood in 1940, her spirit battered but not yet broken. She hoped for a fresh start, but what she found was a town that had already begun to forget her. The roles were fewer, the scripts weaker. Hollywood, as always, had moved on. In July 1942, Frances Farmer's downward spiral took a turn both tragic and farcical. Her husband divorced her that month, and soon after, she was arrested for driving drunk without a license, her high beams blazing in a wartime dim-out zone. When she resisted arrest, the police dragged her to jail. The judge handed her a suspended sentence of 180 days, a $250 fine, and an order to quit drinking. But Frances was not one to bow to authority. She ignored the court's demands, didn't quit drinking, didn't pay the fine, didn't report to her parole officer. A warrant for her arrest was issued after an altercation with a hairdresser on the set of her latest film. Frances, defiant as ever, returned to her hotel, downed a few drinks, took a sleeping pill, and passed out. The police came for her that night, banging on her door. When she didn't answer, they barged in and found her hiding naked behind the shower curtain. She was dragged from the bathroom to jail, denied a phone call, and left to simmer in humiliation. The next day in court, the judge interrogated her with disdain. Had she started a fight on set? Yes, Frances snapped. I was fighting for my country and for myself. Had she been drinking since her last court appearance? Yes, she replied bluntly. I drank anything I could get, including Benzedrine. The judge reminded her of the order to abstain from alcohol. Frances, with her signature sharpness, retorted, Look, I get liquor in my milk, liquor in my coffee, liquor in my orange juice. What do you expect me to do? Starve to death? The courtroom gasped. The judge, unmoved, ordered Frances to begin serving her 6-month sentence immediately. It was then that Frances started asking the questions she should have led with. Where was her phone call? Why wasn't she allowed a lawyer? When no answers came, she let loose a torrent of rage, throwing punches at anyone within reach. The officers piled on top of her, pinning her to the floor and wrestling her into a straitjacket. As they dragged her away, she screamed, her voice echoing through the courthouse. Have you ever had a broken heart? To avoid jail time, Frances's family intervened, convincing the court to allow her to serve her sentence in a sanitarium. But the reprieve was short-lived. Her lawyer father managed to have her reassigned to the legal custody of her mother, a move that would prove disastrous. Her domineering mother promptly committed her to Western State Mental Hospital. 3 months later, Frances was released, supposedly cured. But over the next 6 years, she would be institutionalized twice more, enduring her longest stretch beginning in December 1946. The asylum became a grim backdrop to her life, a place where her spirit was systematically eroded. She was finally released in 1950, but even then, she remained legally under her mother's control, a ward of the woman who had placed her there. In 1953, Frances took the fight to court and finally won back her civil rights. But Hollywood had moved on, and her much hoped-for comeback amounted to a single appearance on This Is Your Life in 1957. The world saw a fragile version of the once fiery actress, a shadow of her former self. She married and divorced twice, eventually settling in Indianapolis, where she hosted an afternoon television show, performed in local stage productions, and appeared in a few television specials. Those close to her whispered about the drinking. It never truly stopped. In 1968, Frances was given a modest advance of $3,500 to write her autobiography. She began collaborating with a ghostwriter and her roommate, Jean Ratcliffe. Drunkenly, she tape-recorded her memories, sobbing as she read aloud from her medical transcripts. The tapes captured her pain, her confusion, and the fragments of a life she struggled to piece together. Before the first draft was completed, Frances was diagnosed with cancer. She died in 1970 at the age of 56, a life cut short and haunted by the scars of her past. These facts are all verifiably true, but after her death, the narrative of Frances Farmer's life spiraled out of her grasp, twisted into a grotesque spectacle of half-truths and outright lies, seized on by opportunists and charlatans to compose a narrative that served their purposes rather than her own. In death, as in life, she was denied the agency to tell her own story, again having her voice stolen from her, becoming a prisoner to other people's narratives. And so, the complications begin with the 1972 book claiming to be Frances Farmer's autobiography. Will There Really Be a Morning? Spans 400 pages, a dramatic saga chronicling her tumultuous life in and out of Hollywood, framed by lurid and harrowing depictions of her time in the asylum. The book was cobbled together after Frances's death by Jean Ratcliffe, the woman who knew her best in her final years. Ratcliffe had lived with Farmer, witnessed her struggles firsthand, and cared for her during her declining health. But Ratcliffe was also under pressure, tasked with repaying the $3,500 advance Farmer had received for the autobiography before her untimely death. To complete the book, Ratcliffe turned to ghostwriter Lois Kibbe, who had been compiling research material, including Frances's tape-recorded confessions, raw, unfiltered recollections soaked in alcohol and grief. Ratcliffe formed the narrative herself, structuring Farmer's fragmented memories as flashbacks, weaving them through graphic accounts of abuse and degradation in the asylum. What emerged was not a straightforward retelling of Frances Farmer's life, but an emotionally charged, almost theatrical work. The book lingered on vivid, harrowing scenes of beatings, ice baths, forced druggings, and isolation, scenes that electrified readers and painted a visceral portrait of suffering. While such abuses were tragically common in mental institutions of the era, the exact details of Frances's experiences are elusive, blurred by time and the dramatized framing of the narrative. Rather than an account rooted purely in fact, Will There Really Be a Morning became something else entirely, a reflection of Frances Farmer as both a victim and an enduring symbol of defiance, molded to satisfy an era's appetite for tragedy. It was a story shaped as much by Frances's voice as by Ratcliffe's need to construct a compelling narrative, one that fused reality with the heightened drama of myth. However, this retelling, while certainly dramatic, would be the closest we would ever get to the real story, and it can be argued that the people writing this had her best interests at heart. The ones that followed absolutely did not, and her story began to take on mythical proportions. In 1975, child star turned experimental filmmaker Kenneth Anger published Hollywood Babylon, a lurid scrapbook of half-truths, urban legends, and scandalous photographs. Within its pages, Anger made two lasting contributions to the Frances Farmer story. First, he published her haunting jail mugshots, images that seemed to embody the disintegration of a once radiant star. Second, he gave her a moniker as evocative as it was tragic: Saint Francis, patron of all the Hollywood Magdalens who have drunk at the well of madness. That same year, Shadowland by William Arnold was published, claiming to unearth the truth about what happened to Farmer behind the locked doors of Western State Hospital. Arnold branded Will There Really Be a Morning as false and offered an even darker account. For the first time, the idea surfaced that Frances Farmer had been subjected to a lobotomy, a horrific procedure that, Arnold claimed, left her a mindless zombie for the rest of her life. But this claim was more invention than revelation. William Arnold was not an investigative journalist or a detective. He was a film critic with connections to Scientology. In the late 1970s, as Arnold worked on his book, the Church of Scientology was intensifying its crusade to discredit psychiatry. Before Shadowland even hit shelves, the Scientology magazine Freedom published an article portraying Frances Farmer as a victim of psychiatric abuse. Arnold's acknowledgments in Shadowland offer further clues about his agenda. He thanked the head of the Citizens Commission on Human Rights for their help in researching the truth. But the CCHR was not an impartial body. It was a Scientology front group dedicated to dismantling the psychiatric establishment. Over the years, this group has blamed psychology for atrocities ranging from the Holocaust to Columbine. After Shadowland's release, Scientology embraced Farmer as the perfect symbol for their campaign against psychiatry, using her story to rally support for their cause. Yet Arnold's claims of a lobotomy rest on shaky ground. While lobotomies were performed at Western State Hospital by Dr. Walter Freeman, the very doctor Arnold accuses of operating on Farmer, there is no record of her undergoing the procedure. And this is crucial. Western State was not shy about publicizing its use of lobotomies. They kept copious records. At the time, they saw the procedure as groundbreaking and sought publicity for their successes. If Frances Farmer, a celebrity, had undergone a lobotomy, the hospital would likely have announced it with fanfare. Furthermore, Will There Really Be a Morning, for all its dramatization of Farmer's suffering, never claims she was lobotomized. Neither Farmer herself, nor Jean Ratcliffe, nor the hospital ever mentioned such a procedure. If it had happened, why the silence? Why would Farmer, Ratcliffe, and the hospital all conspire to bury this detail? And if she was a zombie for the rest of her life, how could we see her on television, giving interviews speaking about her past, marrying twice, performing in stage productions, and hosting television shows? Only Arnold and the Church of Scientology stood to gain from this claim. And in the end, this claim, which he said was absolutely true, would land him in court. But what came next changed the narrative around her forever. William Arnold may have been the first to claim that Frances Farmer was lobotomized, but the image that cemented this myth in the public imagination came from Frances, the 1982 biopic starring Jessica Lange. Directed by Graham Clifford, the film freely mixes fact with fiction, weaving a narrative that prioritizes drama over accuracy. In the director's commentary on the DVD, Clifford openly acknowledges this creative license, saying, "While you try to remain factually accurate, you don't want to get bogged down. The story comes first. The audience isn't going to give two hoots about it. All they want is a dramatic story that holds their attention. If it's based on fact, that's fine, but they don't want to be nickeled and dimed to death with fact. They want a good story." And dramatic it certainly was. The film's climax is a harrowing scene in which doctors perform a lobotomy on Frances, hammering an ice pick through her right eye. The sequence is visceral and unforgettable, etching itself into the collective memory as the definitive end to Frances Farmer's rebellion. But like so much else in her story, this moment is pure invention. In reality, Frances's release from the asylum was far less dramatic. Her parents retained legal custody of her throughout her institutionalizations, and all it took for her freedom was a letter from her father. In 1950, he finally wrote to the hospital, requesting her release so she could return home and care for her ailing mother. There was no medical epiphany, no climactic surgery, just bureaucracy and a family decision. Originally, the producers of Frances wanted to adapt William Arnold's Shadowland for the screen. But negotiations fell through, and the producers decided to move forward without him. Arnold, furious, took them to court. Here's the twist. You can't sue someone for copyright infringement if they make a movie based on the same true events you wrote about in a book. But if you fabricated parts of that story and someone dramatizes your inventions, then you can sue, though at a cost. You'd have to publicly admit that your supposed investigative biography wasn't entirely factual. When Arnold sued, he argued that Frances, a Hollywood film marketed as a fictionalized drama based on true events, had copied his fabrications from Shadowland. In court, Arnold admitted that elements of his book, including the infamous lobotomy claim, were inventions. The judge acknowledged that the movie's fictions mirrored Arnold's, but the judge ruled against him. As Arnold's attempt to profit from his own fabrications now in the film, while still marketing his book as fact, enraged the court. Despite the lawsuit and Arnold's admissions, the myth of Frances Farmer's lobotomy remained unshaken. Thus, the three major sources that disseminated the Frances Farmer legend, Shadowland, Frances, and Will There Really Be a Morning, all contain significant fictionalizations. None were designed to protect Farmer's memory. Each served the agendas of those crafting the narratives. The film Frances presents itself as brave, peeling back the Hollywood curtain to expose the rot beneath. But there is no real revelation here, no daring truth-telling. Instead, it is a cynical exploitation of a troubled former star, a calculated attempt to profit off her pain. Frances Farmer never gave her consent to have her life told, let alone fictionalized, and yet the film transforms her suffering into spectacle, reducing her to a character in someone else's drama. Farmer's actual films, largely forgotten and rarely celebrated, faded into obscurity. Instead, it is the fictionalized story of her life and the grotesque embellishments that endure. For many, Frances Farmer is the woman who was entirely destroyed by the system, her fate sealed by the dramatic climax of an ice pick lobotomy. In a certain sense, she was destroyed, though perhaps not with an ice pick, but in an equally insidious way. Will There Really Be a Morning, for all its inaccuracies, remains a gripping read. And while Frances is no masterpiece on par with Sunset Boulevard, it is a film that burns itself into the memory of anyone who sees it. One haunting scene from Will There Really Be a Morning depicts Frances, during a brief release from the hospital, rifling through her mother's belongings. She stumbles upon photos and press clippings, ads she can't remember posing for, moments she's unsure she lived. Then there are the pictures of her face, familiar yet utterly alien. Frances realizes her likeness has been taken from her, transformed into something she no longer recognizes. Perhaps this moment never happened. Perhaps Gene Ratcliffe invented it. But in a sense, it is the most honest moment in all the posthumous works about Frances Farmer. It captures the deeper truth of her story, a woman's life consumed and distorted, her reality twisted into a consumable Hollywood drama. The enduring image of Frances Farmer is not her own, but one crafted by others, etched into memory with cruel precision. It is not Frances, but Jessica Lange, wild-eyed and kicking, screaming in a courtroom. It is not Frances, but the grotesque fiction of an ice pick driven through her eye, reducing her to a hollow shell. Frances Farmer never agreed to this role, yet it is the only one she plays now. The vibrant, rebellious woman who once dared to defy Hollywood has been replaced by a caricature, a tragic specter endlessly consumed by those who profit off her, yet claim to mourn her. In death, as in life, Frances Farmer's voice has been silenced, her likeness stolen, her truth obliterated. All that remains is the myth, a role she never chose, but one she can never escape. Thank you for joining me this week as we explored the life and legend of Frances Farmer. What are your thoughts on her story? Share them in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. Do you enjoy these Hollywood tales, or are historical narratives more your style? And if there's an extraordinary woman whose story you'd like to see featured, let me know. Your likes, shares, and comments mean the world to us. They not only keep this channel thriving, but also help bring these powerful stories to a wider audience. We're proud to now feature 70 biographies of remarkable women on this channel. Take a look through our collection, and don't forget to tell me your favorites. A heartfelt thank you to our patrons: Velocity Girl, ZenLife68, Jillian Barker, Junie Moon, Philip Gallegos, Kingsley Clark, Kapham Chung, Harry Thurston, Karen Craig, Second Soprano 150, Michelle Lynn Neal, Amber Perry, Bavia Andrea, Tracy Walsh Elizabeth, CTS Bathory, America Marie, and Joy McGuire. Your support truly makes this possible. Congratulations to this week's trivia winner, Music Lover 3205. To everyone watching and sharing in our passion for history, thank you. Until next time, stay curious, keep exploring, and as always, thank you for watching.